You know what's amazing about some of these Democrat media pundits, who are, of course, smarter than all of us? They're producing packages and one-off episodes about combating hate and fighting hate and the rise of white supremacy and all this stuff. And while they're talking about Russia this and Russia that and Russia meddling in our elections, they refuse to accept the fact that some of these public clashes we're seeing are actually being orchestrated by Russian agents on Facebook. Joining us on the program right now is Representative Tom Garrett from Virginia's 5th District. How you doing, sir?
Hey, Mr. Wilkow, great to be on the show. I was taken aback by, and I say that tongue-in-cheek, a news story I saw recently that said that 2/3 of Americans believe that racial tensions are heightened. Well, I wonder why. And the media gladly reports upon that which they have essentially sown for us. So there you go.
Well, how hard is it for someone to create a Facebook event page, right? You create one for neo-Nazis or white supremacists, then another for Black Lives Matter, and magically you pick the same park at the same time on the same, on the same day, and the expected results ensue.
And we judge these metrics by things that are very sort of obscure and they seem easy to quantify, but they aren't. Site page views, etc., which are all easily and readily manufactured. So you create an impression that there is some legion of white nationalists, and praise God there aren't, or legion of Antifa thugs, and that might be closer to true, but also not true. And so then we play on people's fear, and historically, and I mean this for posterity, fear drives bad human behavior. And the Russian intermeddling really has been targeted at undermining confidence in Western-style democracies. It didn't start in 2016. It probably dates back to about 1919. And people in places like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, people in Ukraine, they get it. And the press has really told us part of the story here, but exactly what the Russians sought to do in trumpeting things like extremism in Charlottesville, they've succeeded in by virtue of us not getting the complete story, I think, tragically.
You know, it's amazing, and I'm sure Russia and China and all of their intelligence services and PSYOP units of their, whatever they call them in their various, militaries, are well aware that we have a media that hyperventilates. We have organizations that hyperventilate. If you announce on Facebook that you're organizing, now this Jason Kessler guy was he an Obama guy or a Sanders guy? He doesn't come from any.
It's funny too, because Snopes, which purports to be an adjudicator of that which is true and is not, says he wasn't Occupy Wall Street. But if you Google search WINA Charlottesville, where he's from, they did a story documenting very well that he was right. Occupy Wall Street. Now he's a white nationalist.
So you announced that there's going to be a rally to defend, I don't know, race or what have you. And of course, you get people who are going to sign up. And then you announce that there has to be a counter protest. And of course, you get people who sign up, right? It's really not hard to find angry people amongst us who are willing to gather in the streets. And once you put, fire and gasoline in the same place, the results are, well, they are what they are.
Right, and one of the things, I had the really, really disgusting distinction of having represented the area from whence this guy comes. I don't even want to say his name. And he had come to Washington, come to our office, and we knew he was weird. We didn't know how weird, right? I think he was there in March. Then in May, and I'm a vehement defender of the Bill of Rights and individual liberties stemming from a natural law concept, okay? But don't cry to me about your First Amendment rights being violated and say that you're racially neutral when you march at night with torches wearing all white next to a Confederate statue. That's designed to evoke a predictable and I would argue understandable response. So we kind of knew this guy was somebody who wanted to watch it burn. But when he gets NPR interviews, Andrew, when he is elevated to the level of some leader of humans, which he isn't, right? The photos from his aspirational racist rally in D.C. just yesterday show, 15 lunatics from across the fruited plain, which in a nation of 325 million is pretty low percentage.
Yeah.
But when he's elevated, then of course there's heightened racial fears, heightened racial tensions. This guy is not a leader. He's horrifically antithetical to all that's American, that we should be able to disagree without being disagreeable. And the Russians have trumpeted that and candidly succeeded, I would argue, beyond their wildest expectations. Imagine if Putin strode to a microphone today and said, yes, I did help President Trump win the election. The American media would eat it up, whether it were true or not. They want to hear it.
Now, you were briefed on some of this from the FBI. Is that correct?
We were in a briefing that included the FBI as well as other agency heads to do with Russian intermeddling. It was much written about in the news. The Democrats had screamed for a Russia briefing, and then 23 out of 185 of them showed up. And my line of questioning was, did the Russians exacerbate the Charlottesville events, because I represent Charlottesville, and they said unequivocally, yes, they did. And then my colleague and friend Morgan Griffith leaned over and said, ask him if it's classified. I thought, that's pretty good. So I did, and they said, no, it's not. And I thought, well, nobody's telling this story.
So wait. So you were being briefed by law enforcement intelligence services that the Russians were meddling in society, right? They have seen our addiction to Facebook and Twitter, and the fact that people will in fact show up to events if they are organized online on social media, that it is not very difficult either, right? You look for polar extremes, you look for polarization, you look for people that are going to be angry at the presence of the other group, and you encourage both groups to show up at the same place at the same time. And you were briefed on this, that Russians were behind this, and they said, well, no, this is not classified. I have not seen this anywhere in the media, that the Russians may be behind some of these violent demonstration, counter-demonstration events that we're seeing.
Well, let me be clear, because I don't want to overstate this. My question was, did the Russians exacerbate the events in Charlottesville using the internet and social media? The answer was yes. I would not, because I do not have evidence.
No, hold on. Because I have been able to defend. I have been able to defend the president's comments that there were good people on both sides, and I defend it like this. If you told me that there were people who look at Confederate monuments and say, you know, given the history of the Civil War, this brings pain to people who are descended from slaves, I'd understand that. If there were people on the other side that were saying, please don't tear down these memorials, this is still part of our history, this is not about hate, I'd understand that. And I would imagine that if both those sides of good people who want to debate the issue of the presence of Confederate memorials, they might say, you know what, you're right, that brings pain, but you're right as part of our history. Where does history belong? In a museum. We have come to a conclusion about what the proper course forward is for Confederate war memorials or statues without any violence, with people coming together to actually discuss this and understand it. If you told me that both sides of that argument were people that were good people, I'd agree with that. Now, if you told me there were going to be people wearing paramilitary gear and mismatched sports equipment, and they were going to beat the hell out of each other, I would say, those are the bad people. So there were good and bad. But if you told me the Russian hackers or Russian meddlers were encouraging the people in the mismatched sports equipment and the black hooded sweatshirts, that's the exacerbation, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And that's what happened. And again, if you put an extremist meme on the internet and then you generate 5,000 fake likes or shares, then somebody who's not thinking or who's ill-informed may be more likely to like or share that meme. And so it's like a snowball rolling down a hill. The Russians understand that, and that's what they've done.
So why is it just too good to blame Trump and blame Republicans and blame conservatives and scare people going into the midterms that if the Democrats don't take the House and the Senate, racists are good, racism is on the rise, that white supremacy is on the rise? Like I said, I can understand if someone said, Andrew, those Confederate memorials bring pain to me. I understand that. I don't think that makes someone a bad person for feeling that way. I also don't think it makes someone a bad person who says, look, this is a history here. Not everybody that fought for the South was fighting to preserve slavery. There's more to it than that. Those two groups of people can explain to one another why they want it taken down, why they want it to remain, and maybe that the best course to make both sides agree is to place those monuments in a museum, right? They are still part of the history. You put them in the museum, you don't destroy them, you explain the context through a display, and people come to the museum to understand history. If you told me that's what was originally going to take place, I would say this is the way it should be. If you told me that somebody was rubbing their hands together at the Internet Research Agency of Russia, said, well, how do we make this terrible? But the media doesn't seem to want to do that. They don't want to talk about this.
Well, and let's not conflate stealing votes or moving votes in an election with inflaming passions and sort of hyper-partisanizing the rhetoric, because both are election interference. One's direct and one is sort of tertiary, but that happened, but it wasn't we're taking votes from here and putting them there. There's no evidence of that. President Obama said it, so we'd hope the left would at least believe it.
All right, let me ask you this before we run out of time, and I got to get out of the way for Sean Hannity. Omarosa taping General Kelly in the Situation Room. Are there going to be ramifications for that?
Yeah, it's interesting because D.C. is a one-party consent jurisdiction, so there's no law locally. However, I've had the great honor of, whether in the military or in Congress, going into the SCIF, going into classified facilities, and what she did is a big no-no. Does it rise to a legal threshold? That's debatable. I haven't delved too deeply into it, but I would argue, as a guy who prosecuted for 10 years, it speaks to her credibility by virtue of her respect and integrity as it relates to the system in which she functioned, right? If you know, and everybody knows, that you're not to take recording devices or even your cell phone into the SCIF or the briefing room, and you do it willfully anyway, what does that say about who you are, the veracity of your assertions, and whether or not you're someone to be believed when you make a claim? That's how I would attack this.
Well, if anything, General
I've
Kelly
never even thought twice about checking my phone when I go into these places. It's what you do.
If anything, General Kelly sounded professional. Given the fact, and we read the story, that she tried to use the White House as a backdrop for her wedding photos without even telling the Secret Service or the uniformed Secret Service or anyone. And Kelly believes this is something that's just a disruption, that she's a very disruptive personality. He says right there clearly in the tape, look, just look at this as a year that you spent in the White House. We don't want to harm you. We don't want to, ruin your credibility. He's letting her go from staff in a way that was not meant to smear her in whatever employment she would seek going forward. That sounds professional. It sounds civil. And now you have the media trying to make this out to be that she's some kind of victim. This is what happens when people get let go from their job.
Well, half the world's too busy being offended to be productive, and the other half's too busy being productive to be offended. And we know where she falls.
All right, I got to leave it there, Congressman. Thanks so much for coming on the program. We got to get you back.
Our pleasure. Let's do it.
All right, Representative Tom Garrett, Virginia's 5th District. Did you hear that? The FBI briefed members of Congress in a non-classified way that the tensions at events like Charlottesville are being exacerbated by Russian interference. Did you see that in the media? I don't see it in the media. I know a lot of conservatives that were nervous when Trump said those things. I wasn't. I laid it out. I can defend that there were good people on both sides argument. I could also defend their argument there were bad people on both sides. And it seems like the bad people are being attracted to these events by the Russians. Hannity's up next. We're right, they're wrong. That's the end of the story. The arguments on this radio program cannot be broken. SiriusXM Patriot.